first scripture lesson this morning is from the book of James, chapter 3, verse 13, through chapter 4, verse 3, and then verses 7 and 8a. It can be found on page 1055 of your pew Bibles. We've been reading from the book of James for a few weeks now, and we've continued to call it a letter, which is how it is classified in the New Testament. Although one author I was reading this week suggested that it should have its own genre, more of a book of moral exhortation than a letter, and that's because there's 108 verses in the book of James, and 54 of them contain imperatives, in other words, telling us what we should be doing, which is why some churches and individuals, this author surmises, are not super fond of the book of James, since it's always telling us what to do. Nonetheless, we have a perfect example of that here this morning. Lots of stuff we're being told to do as we read here, beginning in the 3rd chapter of James. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and you do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Our gospel lesson this morning is from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 37, found on page 877. Today's lesson begins with the second of 3 predictions that Jesus makes in Mark's gospel of his impending death and resurrection. And that is followed by a very familiar scene of Jesus welcoming a child into the group of the disciples. It may seem at first glance as though these 2 lessons aren't really connected, but there is a line that sort of draws the 2 of them together that we'll talk about in a little bit. And it's also probably a more serious line, I think, than we may have imagined in hearing this story that is so familiar to us and so sweet in our minds. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. We'll read here in the 9th chapter now. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house he asked them, "What were you arguing about along the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." May God's blessing be upon the hearing and the understanding of this holy word. According to the report in the Portsmouth Herald, you could have heard a pin drop at Eustace Field in Exeter a week ago on Friday night. Moments before beating the Manchester Central football team 49-0, 84 members of the Exeter High School football team stood for an emotional moment of silence just hours after the funeral service for their friend and teammate Cody Brackett, a 16-year-old sophomore who had just taken his own life days before. To say this week was difficult is an understatement, said Exeter coach Bill Ball. Everybody rallied for Cody and his family. It's amazing how when terrible, tragic things happen like this, people pull together. Unfortunately, though, this tragedy wasn't an isolated incident for Exeter High School. Just last October, Connor Ball, a 14-year-old Exeter High School freshman hockey player, also took his own life. And these are just 2 local incidents of a sadly growing trend of teen suicides. According to statistics, 2 million U.S. adolescents attempt suicide each year, with 2,000 youth ages 10 through 19 completing these attempts, making suicide the 3rd leading cause of death among youth ages 15 to 24. Even more startling is the fact that almost 16% of students in grades 9 through 12 report having seriously considered suicide, and 7.8% report having made one or more attempts in the last 12 months. Not surprisingly, the rates of suicidal thoughts are 2 to 9 times higher among those who report having been bullied, with statistics suggesting that 30% of students are either bullies or victims of bullies, and some 160,000 students stay home from school every day out of fear for being bullied. But home is not necessarily a safe space either, as some 35% of students report that they have been bullied online. In addition to this, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. Startling statistics, I know, and not meant to be depressing, just a picture of where we are living here in the year 2012. But why, you may be wondering, are we talking about this on a day when we have just read a wonderfully sweet passage immortalized in Sunday school lessons everywhere and by the song that is this sermon's namesake of Jesus welcoming a little child to sit on his knee? Well, let's take a closer look at Mark's gospel, and I'll see if I can show you where we're headed with this. So our lesson for today, as I said, begins with the second of 3 predictions Jesus makes in Mark's gospel of his passion, death, and resurrection. Following on the heels of the lesson we read last week in which Jesus urged the disciples to pick up their crosses and become his disciples, this is a reminder to them of the need to follow. But they don't get it. Recognizing this, Jesus turns to them once they have arrived in Capernaum and asks them what they were discussing or arguing about as they were walking along the road, and he was sharing this with them. Unable to offer an answer, the silence is deafening. For Jesus was talking to the disciples about being servants and following him on this mission of resisting the empire and changing the world, and the disciples were arguing over which one of them was the greatest. As one author writes, the disciples may not have understood much, but they knew enough to realize that their argument was completely out of line with what Jesus had been talking about. It has to be one of the lowest points in the history of their relationship with Jesus. They are baffled and humiliated. But Jesus is not through with them. Now, lest we be too quick to harshly judge the disciples for their actions, we ought to ask ourselves the question, if Jesus were to ask us what we have been spending our time worrying about when we should have been thinking about discipleship, what would we say? Regardless of our response, the good news is that Jesus doesn't give up on us just as he didn't give up on those disciples. For Jesus responds to the disciples not with chastisement, but by sitting down, the posture of a teacher back then, and gathering the 12 in around him. Clearly, in response to the disciples' argument, he says, so you want first place? Then take last place. Be the servant of all. Now, the Greek word that Jesus uses here for servant is actually diakonos. If that sounds familiar, it should. That's where we get the word deacon or diaconate from. It refers to one who serves or one who ministers. But in Jesus' day, it meant a little more than that. While the word came to refer to a person in ministry, in Jesus' day, it meant someone who served meals. The person who was a servant of all was the lowest in rank of all the servants, the one who would be allowed to eat only after everyone else had eaten to their fill. So Jesus was really calling the disciples to some humble service here. Not only that, but the word for servant actually shares a common root with the word for child. And that's not insignificant because of what happens next. Jesus takes a little child in his arms and says that whoever welcomes that child welcomes him, and whoever welcomes him welcomes not only him, but God as well. Yet this is no saccharine sweet scene. There's something else much larger going on here. For you see, while we have idealized an enduring image of children today, talking about how pure, innocent, loving, and lovable they are, that was far from the case in Jesus' day. Just listen to how one author, mincing no words, describes them. In the Greco-Roman world, including the Jews, children were thought of as unbridled little bits of chaos. They were not considered naive, innocent, sweet, and trusting. Ancients regarded children as terrible nuisances who were to be disciplined and tolerated until they became useful and reasonable adults. Children were the least valued members of society. A father had the right to punish, sell, pawn off, or even kill his own child. Now, while those of us who are parents might feel like those would be good options to have from time to time, the reality is that we love move on with the implications of this, one author offers a very intriguing observation. She says, if this scene in Mark's gospel is taking place privately, away from the crowds, I wonder where that child that Jesus embraces came from, and why he or she has been allowed to hang around with a group of men who are wandering through town. With the information released this week, as you may have seen, by Dr. Karen King at Harvard University about a fragment of papyrus that is purported to make reference to Jesus' wife, could it be that this was Jesus' child here? Or given that the fragment says that Jesus' wife had the potential to be his disciple, could this argue for the existence of female disciples written out of our Bible? And could this be one of their children? Intriguing questions for you to ponder and for us to take up another day. For now, we need to get at what Jesus was trying to get at in taking that child in his arms. He was, as he was so fond of doing, subverting the accepted norms of the societal systems of his day. Instead of seeing a child as a nobody, he is telling the disciples that they are to welcome that child, but not only welcome the child, serve the child as if that child were Jesus. Now that's a huge change in understanding of how the disciples were to be acting in the world and who they were to be caring for. Here, caring for the least of these who had no chance of reciprocating the care that was being offered to them. So in essence, what he is saying is that there's an injustice literally walking around in front of the disciples every day that they just haven't noticed. And I think the message is the same for all of us today. There are injustices, people in need of love that we encounter every day, but remain hidden before us in plain sight. And my friends, if the youth in our lives who are silently suffering through an inner hell that is leading many of them to choose to take their own lives is not that group for us today, then I don't know what group is. And so the question for us should be, how do we respond? Well, I think it goes without saying that we welcome those youth into the full life and ministry of this church, no matter who they are or where they are on life's journey, as our open and affirming statement says, and as I talked about with the kids this morning. Regardless of whether they're gay or lesbian, from broken homes, or walking in here off the street, we welcome them. But it's got to be more than that. Whether we're talking about your own children, your grandchildren, neighborhood kids, children you're teaching in church school, kids you see at the library, students in your school, be aware of the risk signs for suicide. A change in personality, becoming sad, withdrawn, irritable, anxious, tired, indecisive, or apathetic, an inability to concentrate, changes in sleeping or eating patterns, feelings of guilt, shame, or self-hatred, no hope for the future, abuse of drugs or alcohol, nightmares, suicidal impulses, to name just a few. See to it that a child that you think might be suffering from a mental illness is treated for it. Studies show that up to 1 in 10 youth suffer from mental illnesses severe enough to cause impairment, and 80% of those youth receive no treatment for it. Given the fact that 90% of suicides are committed by youth with such an illness, it makes treatment all the more imperative. Take the time to listen to the youth in your lives. Let them know you care. And take any talk that they may share with you about suicide very seriously. Offer to get them help and then go and get it for them. Many studies show that people contemplating suicide are simply unable to get the help that they desire. This means that they want to be helped. As most suicide victims don't necessarily want death, they simply want the pain to stop in their lives. You can help with that. And don't be afraid to bring up the subject. People sometimes think that mentioning suicide will put an idea in someone's mind. This is not true. Discussing the matter openly and freely with someone without showing shock or disapproval can actually be a huge help to them. Talk to your children about bullying and being bullied. Let them know how serious an issue that is. Or go a step further and volunteer at one of the many organizations out there that were created to help these youth in need. My friends, all of this can help. As the current national strategy for suicide prevention suggests, creating supportive family and community environments and enhancing community services can go a long way towards helping to prevent suicide. We in this church and in this community can certainly be a part of making that happen. And know that what you're hearing from me this morning is only the most cursory overview of this subject. If you want or need more information, contact one of your local hospitals, call the U.S. National Suicide Prevention Hotline, look up the National Alliance for Mental Illness or the Trevor Project for LGBT Youth online, or talk to me and I can point you in the right direction. My friends, this is serious business, as the community of Exeter knows all too well right now. And like the issue that Jesus pointed to, it's one that we just don't seem to be noticing. So let's take Jesus' advice, pay attention, and start truly caring for the youth in our midst. For it's not too much to say that the very lives of the youth that we have seen and worship with us here this morning are depending on it. Amen. Our final hymn this